to start getting it on the way, and the different people who are involved. I mean, it's incredible. But I'm sure that in the next 50 pages, I will get to the, the nitty-gritty of starting.
Did your house?
Kids live in Arizona also.
I know.
And they're friends of my kids.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I know it's kids in Arizona.
Yeah.
Because my kids know.
Well, no.
We have,
We're going to see if Michael and Melanie know those kids.
right, they're in Penny and Rick's circle, but I'm not sure about if your children are your children.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm waiting for a text from Melanie. We're making a shit out,
So when did your,
I I walked into my house, finally, went to sleep, took a shower, and then turned my water on, and then went back. Why? I just went straight out.
You still living with your brothers?
Yeah.
From the Steve or what?
Till at least the middle of March.
But she's okay now.
Okay.
Remember, dealing a year.
Well, they're pulling up my hardwood floor that was glued to the concrete.
We do have, amongst other things, a new floor.
Very good.
Yeah.
A lot of new things.
I'm
And
good.
basement.
I'm good.
I don't have a basement.
Oh,
It just went from
Yeah.
the second floor all the way down.
Not that we're taking attendance or anything, but
Good. I actually still work, and I'm a personal assistant to somebody, and when she calls, I have to go.
It's not so bad. It comes with vegetable food.
No, actually, I'm a webmaster and
No, but it's
assistant to a retired Leslie Edges, but she took a fall and really doesn't work. But I will.
waiting for the
Better to help the person who called and be the one that called.
So anyway,
Well, you didn't forget it.
I didn't forget it. Oh, you brought your own?
Yeah.
So anyway, if something happens to this
Well,
dog,
it was-
I want it for dogs, but I know somebody's gonna go get one.
as long as we have room,
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Oh, my gosh. I'm so glad to see you.
So borrow the neighbor's dog for the picture.
I still work as an assistant. So
She
and I had to.
I forget it was one. I really did.
But I'm looking forward to that. I'm still here. What was
I know.
Walk on the rock.
But you know,
She's pretty cool.
right away, when
She
she
has,
called at Hannah's,
come back to the place she was.
somebody said,
Oh, I know, thank you. My daughter's coming.
Well,
Thank you. Yes, I did.
when you have three grandchildren. First of all, you have to see what he's teaching.
So there are no cases there.
So,
Not that I'm amazed that I remember the others.
But I do remember you.
I and St. Kaplan, Norm and I were all of our elementary school.
What is this like?
And we wanted to do stuff.
yeah, I know. No, but we dropped it on.
This is your life, Norman.
I know.
It's so funny.
6 degrees of separation. There was a lot of that.
That's so funny. Oh, I don't think he wasn't lit. It's crazy. My daughter was getting I'm there right now. He was there. He retired from Detroit. He retired from the congregation museum in 2008.
Yeah, I
Happily living out there ever since. It's just, yeah.
practicing the
Yes,
rabbit.
he's still in the yeah. Living in some, something like that, somewhere near Tucson. And he has like a hard time here there. And he plays rabbi. He plays rabbi. He plays when I'm Sunday. Is this Rabbi Klein? Oh, so he's not here yet. So that means
So congratulations. No. Somewhere along the line, my we were, there was, the street was a dead end, and it was wonderful in 1959. I still remember hearing wolves or whatever they were howling.
I lived in Silver Street.
Oh, yeah.
I was in Silver Street. For a
There was no graduation. I graduated.
I'm facing this way. My cousin Mickey. So I went to the Rocky Made show. I said, right. You can just look at this. There's actually oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
You know, I'm looking at going, I'm going with, I'm not, I don't remember where I am.
Okay. I will find Okay, I'm with him in Orlando. Joel and Billy are living right where I live. That's why all the questions that I use in the morning. I know, it's just crazy small world. So I told him I was leaving for 75, so I said I would do it.
See who else I know.
Good. How about you? I'm glad to be here.
Hi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Getting
Friend of
ready for-
yours, huh?
Yeah, that's
Nice.
so crazy.
Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. So glad to be here with you guys. So, first of all, I forgot to mention the bagel and pickup people last week, so I apologize for that. Last week, bagel sponsored by Russell and Nancy Ben-Giat. I hope you guys are watching from Florida this morning. Thank you. Streaming sponsored by Barbara Kuby. And Doris, you picked up the bagels. Okay, belated thank you. This week, bagel sponsored by Maya. You didn't know that, but it's true. Streaming by Barbara Kuby. And Carol, you picked up this morning. Carol did not pick up. Who picked up? Okay, thank you, Ingrid. Thank you so much. Okay, well, Cindy gave me this sheet, and she is nice to see that every now and then Cindy makes a little bit of a mistake. I've worked with her for more than 20 years. She is, as those of you who know her know, extraordinary, flawless, bright, compassionate, everything one would want.
And on vacation.
I'm sorry?
And on vacation.
She's on vacation now. And she went part-time a year and a half ago, and delighted that she has stayed on, but it also gives her time to do some other things. So delighted about that. Okay. Before we start, yes, I know there's something else. So as you know, there are sessions on each of the Warhol series that's in the museum gallery. Tomorrow I will be doing a talk on Franz Kafka. Starts at 3 o'clock in the chapel. Probably an hour and a half. One of the most fascinating of all figures, so do come. I'm struggling with him. He's tough, but really very, very fundamental and just wonderful to have the opportunity to think about Kafka.
There's another discussion about one of the other pieces also tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock.
I don't think so.
Yes, not tomorrow.
Not tomorrow.
I thought it was listed as well.
I hope not. It'll be an interesting exercise in polyphony. Two things going on at the same time. No, not tomorrow.
Okay, good.
Okay, blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us with God's commandments and joining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so in general this year we are doing Torah portion of the week, but I've also come to feel that we can handle this a little bit loosely as long as we're in the neighborhood of the Torah portion of the week. That means we can't be doing Deuteronomy when it's supposed to be Leviticus, but we can be meandering a little bit as we work our way through these Torah portions. So I don't feel strictly obligated to be with the Torah portion, but in its neighborhood. And fortunately, neighborhood is a very elastic term. So that's how we're going to be doing it. So we have begun the book of Exodus, and we looked at the first chapter last week and parts of the second and third chapters. Somebody asked me many, many years ago, and I've mentioned it frequently since, are there any healthy families in the Bible? Which is a sobering question in and of itself. And the answer is not that many. Now, I've always thought that one of them is Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. They do very, very nicely together. But it occurs to me, and I think, Doris, you may have put me up to this one, that we're dealing with a healthy family right here at the beginning of Exodus, with Miriam and Yocheved, Moses' mother, and Moses, who, as we noticed last week, collaborate on producing the end, the goal that they have wanted to produce. So, in some sense, this is a healthy family too, although we have to reckon with the relationship between Moses and Aaron, which is a complicated one. They are partners, but also they're opponents, and each of them might be taken to be a kind of paradigm as a certain kind of office, Moses as prophet and Aaron as priest. So they're individuals, but they're also representative. Some of you may know Arnold Schoenberg's great opera, Moses and Aaron. And Schoenberg deals with this question of the kind of typological feature of each. Aaron sings in this atonal, in this maybe serial 12-tone opera. It's a glorious opera, but it takes a while to get into it. Moses never sings, he only talks. And Aaron sings. Aaron has the ear of the people. Moses struggles to communicate with the people, right? O Vort, varum du mis failed. Why do you fail me? Word, I have the word, but I can't communicate it. So Moses has his head in the clouds. He's conversing with God. He has the doctrines, but he can't get the people to accept them. Aaron has the ear of the people, and he wonders what the big deal is. I mean, the people had a need, he says to Moses, when Moses rails at him. The people had a need, and I responded to it. I mean, after all, what are we all about? We're leading the people. So that the tension between the role of the prophet and the role of the priest is represented already in the book of Exodus by Moses and Aaron. So, but of course they collaborate as well. God says to Moses, when Moses says, I don't know how to speak, why are you sending me to speak to Pharaoh? God says to Moses, I will give you a spokesperson. Aaron will be your mouth. It turns out not to be the case, but there is the idea of collaboration and working together. So Moses and Aaron function in two very different ways as members of a family. You know, later on, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam object to the singularity of Moses in the book of Numbers chapter 12. And God has to say to them, look, I've chosen Moses. There are prophets and there is a singular prophet. Most prophets speak through dreams and images. With Moses, I speak mouth to mouth. And so he punishes Miriam for her rebellion, and Moses has to plead with God to heal her. So that's another example of the problems within that family. So it's not just a family that always does well together, although they're doing well together here. So what I'd like us to look at is how Moses and his family deal with the challenges that they're facing, especially what does it mean to be a prophet. So let's look at the beginning here in Exodus chapter 2. We looked last week at the way in which Miriam and Moses' mother work together with Pharaoh's daughter, who expresses great sympathy for the crying Moses. And without going over that again, let me just say one thing by way of summary. This episode is an interesting example of how vulnerable people satisfy their own needs while working with a hostile society. Okay? So Miriam and Moses' mother create a plot in order to do two things: to get Moses safely embarking on his future, while also being able to nurture him as well as to satisfy the needs of the hostile society. In other words, they take advantage, of course, of the sympathy of Pharaoh's daughter right from the house of hostility. But they're able to save his life, to get him to grow up or to become socialized in two communities. His own birth community, so that he feels their fidelity, loyalty to his own family's community, while also being able to be raised in Egyptian society so that he is able to navigate that society's language used both literally and figuratively. So what they have done is they've been able, and maybe this is somehow a paradigm of the way in which minorities have to be dexterous in being able to deal with a hostile society while preserving themselves. Okay? So we have this notion throughout the Middle Ages of a court Jew. And the court Jew is somebody who is faithful, loyal to the Jewish community, but understands the language of the larger society, in this sense can represent the Jewish community in and to the larger society. Theodor Herzl is an excellent example of this, because Herzl, even though he had a very attenuated Jewish identity, was able to recognize the need of the Jewish community for leadership, but he also was a person of European culture. And he was a columnist for one of the great newspapers of that year, the Neue Freie Presse, out of Vienna. So Herzl was a person who could represent the Jewish community and its needs to the larger society. And that's exactly what Herzl did at the beginning of his Zionist adventure. He went from place to place, official to official, trying to get support of the non-Jewish community to support this Zionist adventure. And what Herzl was especially interested in doing was what he called solving the Jewish problem. The Jewish problem, as he understood it, was anti-Semitism. And was to him a millennial problem. The Jews are always vulnerable. No matter how long they have lived in a society, they're always seen as aliens, Herzl said. And he wanted to try to solve the Jewish problem, anti-Semitism. And the way to do it was to get the Jewish people out of harm's way, take them to another place. For Herzl, his Zionism didn't require going to the land of Israel. Just to take the people out of the conflagration that was assaulting them and get them to a place of safety. He quickly learned that that was not going to be viable. And to the Jewish community. And one of the things that Herzl felt very strongly about, and here he's a child of the Enlightenment, he certainly recognized the bankruptcy of the Enlightenment promises, but he was also a child of the Enlightenment because he valued the role of reason, of rationality. Herzl thought that the Zionist movement would be a peacemaker. It would solve the problem of anti-Semitism for the Jews, but it would also solve it for the Gentile community too, because anti-Semitism is a poison that affects those who exhibit it. So by taking the Jews out of harm's way, he was solving. He was going to, at long last, eliminate anti-Semitism, both against the Jews and for the perpetrators. See? So Herzl was a rationalist in this sense, but he was unable to do, would have been unable to do what he did unless he had strong conversancy with both societies, the Jewish society and non-Jewish society. And this is Moses. Moses is also what we might call the first court Jew, who, after all, was able to go in to speak to Pharaoh throughout the early chapters of Genesis. Why was he able to do that? He knew the language of the court, and he was recognized as a part of Egyptian society, while also being able to speak for the Jewish people. So, in a way, this story, though it's a prelude of the whole Exodus from Egypt saga, is also a representative example of the way in which, down through history, Jews, but not only Jews, minorities, have been able to find a way to have representatives with feet in both societies. So that's one of the things we learn, I think, or can infer from the early verses of chapter 2. So now I want to look at verse 11 of chapter 2 with the topic sentence being, what are the qualities of a paradigmatic, normative leader of a people? What do they need to possess? What attributes do they need to exhibit in order to do this successfully? And I think that's what these stories in chapter 2 are all about. Notice or remember that God doesn't call Moses until chapter 3. So what we're learning about Moses is what, if you allow me to say it this way, God is learning too. Is Moses the kind of person God ought to choose for this large adventure? So when we ask, why did God choose Moses? The answer is, read chapter 2, and you'll see. When we ask the question, why did God choose Abraham? We don't have those prefatory stories. Abraham is chosen all of a sudden, without warning, out of the blue. So why God chose Abraham is a mystery. And I think that's part of the Torah story, that unprecedented, unexpected things can happen. And here God all of a sudden chose this one person. Now Abraham vindicates God's choice. But according to the Torah, God doesn't know this in advance. Unless you make the assumption, which the Bible doesn't make, that God is omniscient. That's a philosophical idea, not a biblical idea. Although the Bible moves toward that in a non-philosophical way. So let's look at verse 11. Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So we might call this partisanship. Moses favors his own people, one of his kinsmen. And that's what it says. It's not yet a question of justice. That isn't raised here. It's a matter that he prefers to favor his own people. Okay? So, the Torah makes that explicit. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. It reminds me of Plato's Republic, chapter 1, where they're looking for definitions of justice. And this is one of the early definitions by an interlocutor, his name is Polemachus, who says, justice is helping your friends and harming your enemies. That's what's going on here. Of course, Socrates immediately takes that apart, showing the limitations of that without saying that the whole notion is bankrupt. It just can't be the definition itself of justice. So the Torah also, without making a big deal of it, recognizes the limitation of this first attempt to understand Moses' loyalty. Okay? So, verse 11 and 12, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. And he looked this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian. So he's afraid, he's got some fear of being noticed. Okay? When he went out the next day, I just love this. It's we've got to supplement the first episode with another episode. It's as if the biblical author, this is my notion of not making a big deal of it, moves quickly to a complementary episode. When he went out the next day, he found two Hebrews fighting. Notice how clever this is. No longer can partisanship favoring your own be the decisive factor, because these are two Hebrews. It's as if the author recognized the power of the first story, but also its limitation. He's not denying that loyalty to one's own is important. He's just saying it's insufficient. We need more. So he said to the offender, Vayomer lo rasha, the one who did evil. Okay? So now this is a matter of not partisanship, but right and wrong. Okay? So this is an attempt to deal with the question of justice. Right? So there are two principles at work here. Partisanship and justice. I mean, I don't know that Plato ever read the book of Exodus, but it's the same kind of discussion which one can do, while waiting for a red light. You can read these 4 verses while waiting for a red light. You can't read Book 1 of the Republic by waiting for any red light or green light. That we won't wait for a green light. So when he went out the next day, he found 2 Hebrews fighting. So he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" And he retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you kill the Egyptian?" Oh, the matter is known. Moses was frightened and thought the matter is known. When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian and sat down beside a well. Okay, so Moses hightails it out of there. Notice that we could understand these 2 principles, loyalty to one's own and loyalty to justice, spatially. We can draw a picture of these 2 principles. And the picture has 3 components: God, Moses, the people. And to which of these is Moses loyal? Should he primarily look up at the issue represented by God, right and wrong? Or should he look down to the needs of the people? And the answer is, he's caught in the middle. Isn't that the dilemma of the prophet? That the prophet intends, or by vocation, should be speaking for God. Speaking for God to whom? To the people. So the prophet is challenged, called to bring God's message to the people. And it's often a harsh message. You think you're special because God brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I brought the Moabites out of Kaftor. Amos says, chapter 2 or something like that. So don't think that you're the only ones whom God chose. That's tough medicine for a people that has thought itself a chosen people. Yes, a chosen people, not the chosen people, God is saying. So Moses must, by vocation, transmit God's word to the people, which is going to alienate him from the people, because the people would rather not be challenged, let's assume. On the other hand, it goes the other way too. So far, we've only talked about the second story, justice, represented by God to the people. What about the first story? Fidelity, loyalty to one's people. So not only does Moses, or let's put it this way, the prophet, have to look up for direction to speak God's word to the people, he also has to look down for direction, bringing the people's needs to God. Isn't that true? In the book of Amos, when God is ready to destroy the people, Moses says, wait a minute, the people are small. Give them a chance. I mean, what are you expecting from them? And God listens to Moses. Okay, I won't destroy them. And this happens a couple of times. And finally God says, no, I've decided that I am going to destroy them. So Moses is both the prophet who brings God's word to the people and an intercessor for the people who bring the people's needs to God. So these two stories can be graphed in this way. And I think the title of this picture is The Intractable Dilemma That the Prophet Faces. How to do two things at once. To speak for God to the people and for the people to God. And that's the dilemma of prophecy already foreshadowed right here in 4 quick verses. I mean, it's quite extraordinary what the author has accomplished here. And by the way, if you're God and you recognize that your people are suffering in Egypt, and you infer from this that I'm going to have to bring the people out of Egypt, out of suffering, but I'm going to need a leader to do it, what are the criteria? What are the qualifications of a leader? The story here, the author is telling us why Moses was a good choice. Because he's interested in both justice and the needs of the people. And those are not, you can read the sport page and then you can do the crossword puzzle. No conflict between the two. You can do those two things at the same time. To be devoted to justice and to the needs of the people who may not care about justice, that's a problem. And so, here's the question. Who would want to be a prophet? Who would want to accept that? Then that's just what Moses comes to do here. This is, I think, a surgical investigation of what it means to be a prophet and why Moses is the right person. And part of why he's the right person is that he begs to be relieved of it from time to time, recognizing very well that the right person is going to have problems that are not accidental. They go along, they're part of the essence of being a prophet. Stuart?
A good example of that is the story of Jonah, who is a reluctant prophet, reluctant to go to Nineveh and claim that God will destroy it in 3
Right.
days.
No, that's a good point. Generally, the prophet's role is transitive. He's got an idea and he needs to pass it on to somebody else. In the book of Jonah, the dynamic is not transitivity, but reflexivity. Who's the object of the lesson here about prophecy? Jonah himself. In other words, the prophet in the book of Jonah is meant to recognize the problem that he himself is facing. It's reflexive. And so focuses attention on the dilemma of the prophet, you know. Jonah's got problems because he knows that God is a forgiving God. And so he goes to Nineveh and he preaches to them, and they repent. Nothing happens. What's the outcome? Nothing. God forgives. What's the difference between saying that God is going to forgive you and nothing therefore happens because they repent, and no God at all? Who's responsible for nothing happening? Maybe somebody, but maybe nobody. So this is why Jonah, I think with great power and plausibility, wants to resist this. You're a forgiving God. If you're going to punish them, then your existence is very clear. If you forgive them, that's equivalent to nothing happening. So let's go on. So God has learned, as we have learned, two things about the prophet here which are in deep tension with one another. Always in deep tension. Don't you remember in the trial of Socrates when they're trying him because they think that he's bad for Athens, and they say to him, what should your punishment be? And he says, what I really think would be just is if you would give me a lifetime meal ticket. Because really, I'm the best person there is for the health of Athens. You don't recognize it, but it's true. I'm like a gadfly on a horse's back, poking it to keep it alert and awake. That's what the philosopher does. Of course, the problem there with that metaphor is the fly is also nourishing itself when it pokes the back of the horse. So, and this is what Socrates is accused of by Alcibiades in the Symposium. You're really doing this for the health of your own soul. So this is a wonderful critique of Socrates himself. Okay, I digress. So here we are. So now we're in, verse 15. When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian and sat down beside a wall. Next episode, and we're going to learn something else about Moses. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But shepherds came and drove them off. Persecution. Moses rose to their defense, and he watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, this is Jethro. Jethro has 4 names. It's not clear. They're all Jethro, but that's how it looks. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you come back so soon today?" And they answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." Okay? But Tomar Na'ish Mitzri, an Egyptian man, Hitzi Lanu, the verb for rescue. He rescued us. Why? Because he was enraged by what he saw. And therefore, he didn't flee the scene. He entered it at his own peril to rescue those who are oppressed. Wouldn't this be a good attribute for a deliverer? To be willing to deliver? So we've learned 3 things now about Moses. Devoted to justice, devoted to his people, and willing to intercede in a crisis situation at his own peril to save somebody else. He said, verse 20, to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why did you leave the man? Ask him in to break bread." Moses consented to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah, his wife. She bore a son whom he named Gershom, from Ger Sham. Sham is there, Ger is stranger. For he said, "I've been a stranger in a foreign land," which is a good translation, but not as elegant as the King James, right? King James translated, "I'm a stranger in a strange land." It's one of the great lines in the King James Bible. Except in the Hebrew, it's a fine translation, but it obscures the fact that we have two different words here. Ki amar ger, stranger, hayiti, I am be'eretz nochriya, in a foreign land. Okay? So Moses exhibits something else here. The yearning for home and the sense of being off balance when one isn't at home. Moses is a searcher for home, isn't he, his whole life? A new home, but a home nevertheless. Not the home in the empirical world, but the home in the aspirational world. So, the empirical world, his home is Egypt. But Egypt is a problematic land for Moses and for Moses' people. What he needs is a new home, the land of Israel. And he's on the trail of Israel his entire life, isn't he? So Moses, I don't know, is it strange to say, here he's yearning for his home in Egypt. I mean, that's clear. But by extension, when one thinks about the qualities of a person who's tasked with what Moses is tasked by, is to be able, let me put it this way, see if you buy this. Moses has nostalgia. What is nostalgia? The yearning for what we have already had but lost. From the Greek word nostos, which means home. Moses has nostalgia for what he's never experienced, but about which he has an image. He's nostalgic for bringing to realization the home he has already lived with in his mind. Home for Moses is an idea, and he's yearning for it. He feels estranged from it. He's a stranger here, but in another way, Moses is a stranger for the rest of his life because he knows what home is. 4 things already: justice, partisanship, deliverer, home, that Moses stands for and leads the people through this grid, this prism of ideas. Kathy?
Can we make a 5th one, identity?
Okay.
So, as modern people are struggling with identity and not sure who and what they are.
Yeah.
So we see a child separated from a mother, so that identity is gone, taken on by an Egyptian, somehow raised, knowing that he's different, but his Hebrewness, how is that defined within his experience growing up? We have no idea, because it's not talked about here. How does he identify as being different? And then he breaks up a fight. He identifies on one side, not the other. But then when he goes to identify with 2 Hebrews, then the identity gets more complicated.
There you go.
And the Egyptian Pharaoh, or whoever, says, no, you identified wrongly. You didn't identify with us, so you're out of here.
Yeah.
So now, and when he's in Midian, he's suddenly identified as the Egyptian.
Mm-hmm.
So he's going back and forth And I'm curious as to how we perceive that he assumed his identity. How does the Hebrew identity saga come through this?
It's like, here's the image I have, Kathy. You want to dip your toe into the lake. So what you do is you walk toward the lake, and you're right up against the lake, and here's the water. And you're asking, how do I get into the water? The answer is, just take the next step. You have identified Moses' identity as, why not just say, all the things that you mentioned are components of a complex identity. That's his identity, as is most of our identities. I mean, how do I identify myself? How do you identify yourself? Rabbi. Okay, sure. That's it? No. Also, Y and Z and A and B. How about you? Is one thing your identity? No. The richer the life, the more things there are in the composite known as identity. Why not? You walked right up to the answer. You gave it, I think, eloquently. Yes, he's all these things, filled with ideas, ideals, filled with things to which he's devoted, and an identity filled with tension.
So we have constancy of his own identity, but the exterior world causes the conflict. You're on our side, you're not on our side, you're one of us, you're one of them. That is very separate from what we see as being an internal identity of a justice maker, of a leader, of a intercessory, and ultimately to be a prophet. But yet it is the others who confound that identity.
And isn't that the way it is? I mean, look, I could sit at home and go to the store and get food and read and watch TV and listen to music. This would all be my identity by myself. Once I step outside of my house, my identity is now a function also of how I relate to the outside world and how it relates to me. I give a sermon that I love, and then in the line afterwards, a number of people tell me they didn't understand it, they didn't agree with it, and so on and so on. So I have two choices here. I know this is a great sermon. On the other hand, part of my role is to talk to other people, and other people have a view. Why would I be impervious to what people tell me if my goal is to communicate with them? They don't tell me the nature of that, the value or the lack of value of that sermon, but they contribute to my understanding of it. So Moses is a public person, and the public has a view of him. Egypt has a view of Moses, as well as the people with whom he walks through the wilderness. Moses has a complex identity. Is that good enough? I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, it's complex. It's another thing to be able to list the components of the complex identity. It's systematically complex in the sense that it can't be reduced to simplicity. These components are in tension with one another inherently and inevitably. To me, this is the definition of a rich life, lived in tension among the different things to which a person is loyal and cares about. I'll be a little bit confessional here. Freud says that the nature of a flourishing life is zu lieben und zu arbeiten, to love and to work. And throughout my life, I have asked people I value, how are you doing with those things? Fine. Most people say fine. To me, it's always been attention. Devoted to my work. Sometimes it's easier, some of you will agree with this, to come to work than to struggle at home. Well, you know, there's struggles at home, the family and so on. So life is filled with tension, which gives it the energies, and also some of the pains, of course. And that's Moses, isn't it? I mean, filled with all that. Patty?
I wish Kathy had been at our racial justice book discussion last week. She could have done a Devar Torah, because our book was by Michael Twitty, who is a Black Jewish food writer. And the theme of our discussion, where a few of us in this room were there, was being able to identify yourself as part of a group and having code words to relate to other Jewish people so that you develop that quick intimacy as part of a group, versus being judged from the outside and identifying in Moses' case as you're Egyptian. It seemed like he was identified as Egyptian more by the daughters of Jethro, wherever he is, than him identifying himself, like I'm an Egyptian. And that's the tension between what you want other people to see and value in your identity versus the assumptions other people make about you because of how you dress, the color of your skin, how you cook. It was a really rich discussion, but I wish you'd been there to bring this up.
That's a great example.
We didn't have any biblical references.
That's great. Very good.
For some reason, I keep thinking of Churchill.
I'm sorry?
For some reason, I keep thinking of Churchill
Okay.
as an example. He grew up in a very wealthy family. He didn't really have to relate. He was, he was in the wars, but he wasn't, and then he has to get the people behind him to do what has to be done in a very treacherous time.
Franklin Roosevelt may be another example. Yeah. Right. We're talking now about, I promised people who are watching that I would try to repeat the comments. We're talking about people that we know or interact with or have know in history who have had these kinds of dilemmas too. Jim, you had a...
Well, I think there's another dimension that we kind of skipped over here, and that is the Midianites were a pretty big group and a very separate group from the Egyptians. Jethro wasn't just one common shepherd. He was the head of that whole thing.
Right.
So it's coincidental that all of a sudden Moses gets along with this third group. Not only gets along with it, he marries into it, and apparently quite comfortable about it. And it's reciprocal. It's not a one-sided thing. They welcomed him. They had to assume he was Egyptian because the Hebrews, I don't think they could leave where they were. So if somebody came from there, you automatically assume it's an Egyptian.
Yes.
And the fact that now his father-in-law is the head of another big group.
Yes.
You see the multi-facet of the guy, and the fact that he can probably get along with just about anybody. And
Jethro.
Back to the partisanship. I know the point of that he killed the soldier is the partisanship, but nonetheless, didn't he see right and wrong in front of him and choose the right?
Right. Although the Torah, no, I think that's a good point. What you're saying really is there may not be or isn't a clear distinction between those two principles. But the Torah seems to want us to see them as at least intention when it says in verse 11, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen.
Yeah.
And the fact that it says that, I think, wants to underline the kin. But I think you're right. By the way, Jethro has an interesting life throughout the temple, right? The Torah. When Moses comes to Mount Sinai, it's Jethro who helps him decide how to manage the organization of the government, the judges. You're spending too much time. And later on, when they're about to leave Sinai, Moses says to Jethro, join us. Let's go together. And Jethro says no. So Jethro is really, represents the philo-Semitism and not the this is an anachronistic use of these terms. But yeah. Okay. Hold on. Yes.
Yeah, I have a lot of problems with this. I'm not sure that justice is the right thing to say. I kind of look at Moses as maybe having empathy, and Mike is right. He goes ahead and he kills this Egyptian. He doesn't try to mitigate the fight or anything else. He takes things all into his own hands. I'm not sure he's a good example at that point for us as to how he acts.
So,
and he doesn't then try and explain it to his people. He runs away. He's not really being a leader running away, although he's saving his life. I have a lot of problems with the way this is presented to me, and there's a lot of questions.
So the comment is that I've tried, I'm going to build on your point. You may not like everything I'm about to say, but I've tried to build a more or less positive view of Moses and the various components of that positive image. And you are now saying, wait a minute here, it's not all that positive. There are some negative things. He acts, we might say, recklessly. He doesn't think about what the right thing to do is. He just flies off the handle and kills the Egyptian, and then he runs away. I love that comment. I really do. You've added something to our understanding of Moses. And one of the reasons I love it is that we see it in Moses' subsequent activity. You know, he flies off the handle at God later on. Did I bear this people that you're asking me to nurse them like a mother? How about choosing somebody else? I'm out of here. So, and Moses does act in a very precipitous way sometimes. So good, that's another component of Moses' complex identity. I mean, I think we think that righteous anger is a good thing, but righteous anger can eventuate in reckless anger. I mean, anger can be used positively, but it also can... So once you have the capacity to be really angry, now all of a sudden your complexity takes on another dimension, doesn't it? Because you can be a destructive force. I think that's an excellent point. What is that point? That Moses is a flawed exemplary figure. He's a tremendous leader. I mean, he stays the course, doesn't he? Through all kinds of resistance, and yet he's flawed in a way that you point out and that we should be watching for. I love that. Thank you for that comment. Cindy?
It's also an example of his humanity. I mean, he is not an exalted figure beyond all the human frailties as well, which makes him a very fascinating and very important avatar for us.
Exactly, that's great. Moses is like all of us, only more so. Yeah, love that. Ron?
I'm troubled by what I see here as premeditation and a concern for his own safety and perhaps some planning. He looks around. He doesn't act impulsively. He doesn't confront the aggressor. He becomes passive. And he looks around to make sure, why? That nobody can see him, there's guilt
Yeah,
in thought about what he's about to do.
yeah.
He acts.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps he did not intend the death of the Egyptian.
Yeah.
But certainly some harm.
Yeah.
And then he readily acts to hide his, quote, crime, his, quote, action.
Yeah.
To hide it so he is not discovered. Later in the paragraph, we learn that his biggest fear is not retribution from God, but that the Pharaoh will learn about what he's done and punish him.
Yeah.
So he runs.
Yes.
So it troubles me that A, he appears to be a bad guy.
A bad guy?
A bad guy.
A bad guy.
And secondly,
No, I see, yeah.
at least not thus far, there is no adversity to his action other than when the Pharaoh learns of the action.
He gets away without...
He gets away with it, totally.
Okay. Yeah. So that Ron is also making the point that we've got on our hands a problematic figure as well. A hero who is also problematic. I'm tempted, Ron, to counter by wondering whether or not what you're describing as bad is not prudence. That he recognizes danger and he reacts prudentially to get himself out of harm's way. If it's prudence, it's not as damning, so to speak, as what you've said. Would you accept prudence as an alternative reading?
Only in the disposal of the corpse.
Only in, okay, very good. So we don't get him off the hook that easily. Good.
I wouldn't.
Okay, so, you know, we should be recording this session, really. I mean, we are building, I've built a very sunny picture of Moses. And you know what? I'm sticking with it. But you guys have poked a few holes in that sunniness and seen that this is a flawed guy. Look what we did together here. I mean, we really created a rich composite of a human being to the everlasting gratitude of the author, who's a genius, maybe even God. And it would be useful, we ought to keep this in mind as we come to explore how the story continues and what this guy Moses seems to us to be at different stages along the way. Yeah, we got the preface of the biography, where the author has said, well, here's my conclusions, now let's follow the story to see about, the preface always written later, after the book is written. But how's the book going to unfold it? Scott, did you have a comment to make? I got you.
I'm trying to articulate it right now. You alluded to it earlier. These last two comments brought in the fact that there's not necessarily one attribute, one character trait to play. There's multiple ones that play. And another dimension, which is the word you used and Jim used, is motivation. And you alluded to that earlier with Socrates, with his trial.
Yeah. Very good.
When you brought up the word tension, you said there's a tension between you and the outside world that you thrive on, you relish. This is not your motivation, but your motivation is a good one. Another motivation might not necessarily be to act in that role.
Yeah.
Yourself is a controllable facet. The rest of the world isn't controllable. Is this an attempt to exert control? Some control in your life over that other thing. That was the issue somebody brought up with Jonah and Nineveh.
Yeah, yeah. Are you
So
saying,
motivation has to be evaluated, and that's the most difficult.
that's a very good point.
You can see the outcome of action, but you can't necessarily discern what the motivation is in any of these events.
So Scott is raising the question of motivation. And you use me as an example here in what I said earlier. In my connection, my relationship to the outside world, I'm looking at it as wholly positive because I really love them. But maybe my motivation is self-serving. I'm interacting with the outside world to get fed by the outside world. So what is my motivation? And by the way, I mean, our motivations are often not disclosed to us very easily. I suppose that's what gives psychiatrists their business, their vocation. Yeah, so right. Motivation. Wow. Yeah. I suppose we could infer, if we have enough examples of how the person operates, we might be able to infer motivation, but it's always an inference. What is Moses' motivation? Maybe this is one of the reasons he's so upset when God says you can't get into the promised land. Hey, you called me when I was 80. I was minding my own business. I was deep into retirement. I slept till 11. I took the sheep out for a while. I came back. I watched a little TV. I had dinner. I went to bed. You called me and said, leave my people. And I said, okay. And for the next 40 years, I did it. And now I don't get to reap the reward? What is going on here? To which it reminds me of some story. I can't remember exactly what. What, you did it for yourself, God? Is that why you did it? Is that what you're telling me? That your motivation was to get the glory for yourself? No, I called you to serve the people. That's the issue of motivation. Why? Yeah. You remember the Midrash says that Moses pleads with God to let him get into the promised land, you know? He even says, I'll go in as Joshua's assistant. How about if I do that? And I don't have to be the boss anymore. And this is the Midrash. And the Midrash says, well, God says, okay, let's try it out. So the next morning, Moses and Joshua walk to the tent of meeting, where customarily, when they get there, Moses says to Joshua, stay outside, I've got a private conversation with God. In this example, Joshua says to Moses, stay outside. I'm going to talk to God. And Moses recognizes how impossible it would be for him to. So that experiment doesn't work. He even says, I'll go in as an animal. I just want to go into the promised land. And God says, finally, the Bible quotes this, Rav Lecha, enough, you've said enough. This is my decree. So what was Moses' motivation? There is a plausibility in saying, who cares? I mean, we're human. We are also self-serving. E. Cummings says, I never saw a peripherally situated ego. We're all egocentric. He says, we're the whole ball of wax to ourselves. And that's always true for all of us, but we can transcend that without eliminating it by being other-directed as well. But I like that question of motivation. Let's go on a little bit. So here we are in chapter 2, verse 23. So Moses is now in Midian with Jethro and Zipporah. A long time after that, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from the bondage rose up to God. God heard their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. which is not exactly what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew is much more cryptic. Vayeda Elohim, and God knew. In the Hebrew psychology, knowing is not what it sometimes is for us, abstract propositions. It's filled with emotion and intimacy. When you know something, you're tightly connected to it. So God is emerging here as a caring deity who knows something, maybe knows his obligation, knows what he's about to do. Now, we haven't seen God acting in the story since before the Joseph story. God never acts in the Joseph story he's referred to. So God has been silent for at least a half a millennium. And all of a sudden, he breaks out from his onlyness into relationship. I find that, a lot is happening in chapter 2, isn't it? It's such a rich chapter. Doris?
The word that struck me in what you just read is the word cry, because this chapter opens with the daughter of Pharaoh hearing the cry from the basket, the cry of the baby. Verse 6.
Right.
She opened it, she saw it was a child, a boy, crying.
Yeah.
And God heard a cry. I also think in the section right before this that we were discussing, Moses hears the cry of the oppressed in every single situation.
I love that.
He favors, he sides with the oppressed. He hears the cry of the oppressed.
Yes.
With the Egyptian, with the Hebrew, and with the girls at the well. He sees oppression and comes to the rescue.
You're not saying that God sees all of those examples of
No.
crying.
I'm saying at the end we hear God paying attention to a cry. In the beginning of this chapter 2, we found a woman who heard the cry of a baby. And I'm saying in the middle of the story,
yes,
we have Moses hearing the cry of the oppressed and siding in each of those three situations
what you're saying.
with the oppressed.
I get you. So the thread is the crying, and somebody is paying attention to it and sympathizing with it. So a motif in this story is suffering with those who are receptive to, ready to respond. Would that be a good summary? Not quite.
That's sort of the flip side.
Oh, is it? Okay. Yeah.
And that's right. I'm saying that we have a prophet here, Moses, who is showing in this chapter that he is hearing, he is a perfect candidate to hear the cry of the people, the Hebrews. Because he had been hearing the cry all along of oppressed people.
Where do you see that?
Well, he sees oppression when
the Egyptian
is killing a Hebrew, and he comes to the defense of that Hebrew by killing the Egyptian. We can talk about motivation, we can talk about that, but what he did comes out of, I'm on the side of, you're doing something wrong to another human being.
Yes.
And the same with the Hebrews attacking each other. Stop it, because this isn't the way to live, and I'm on the side of the one who is suffering.
Moses.
Moses is. And with the women at the well, because they're being harassed by these shepherds, he's tired out, he's running away from Pharaoh, but he comes to their defense. He's on the side of the poor. He's on the side of those who cry out.
As is Pharaoh's daughter. Is this part of your point?
It's very interesting, isn't it, that this whole chapter is about hearing the cries.
Hearing the cries, yeah, good. Right. Could one make any, so Doris is saying, right, one of the leitmotifs of the chapter is crying out from suffering. So there's suffering throughout, and there's also responses to the suffering. Suffering doesn't go unresponded to.
That's it.
And is that it, or is there more to say about it? Is the author making a point about life? Is this a sermon? When you hear the outcries of the oppressed, respond to them as everybody did in this story. Could I present this as a sermon about response? Here's my material for something like that. Some generalizations, it's a dry way of saying it, can be, okay, very good. Another dimension of the richness of the chapter. The next time somebody asks me what is my favorite chapter in the Bible, used to be Zechariah 14. Stuart.
I'm curious, Moses says, why do you strike your fellow? He never answers. He never gets an answer to that. He retorted, who made you chief and ruler over us? Why did he strike the fellow?
Well, now you're in verse 13 of chapter 2. So Moses went out the next day. He found 2 Hebrews fighting, so he said to the offender, Moses says to the offender, why do you strike your fellow? And what's your question?
He never gets an answer.
He never gets an answer. I see what you're saying. This may be the comment here about Moses acts very precipitously. That's your point. He should ask, why are you doing this? Maybe there's a reason. Is that your point? So is this as something
like
about
Cain and Abel?
Am I my brother's keeper, he says.
Why? What is the answer to that?
So does this amount to something of an indictment of Moses?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I mean, that's a good point, actually. Could we call it, would you be satisfied by calling it righteous anger?
Well, he never gets an answer.
He doesn't get an answer. But what about the gesture itself? The gesture itself is laudable. He's seeing a tough guy beating up a weak guy, let's say. And he goes to his aid. Maybe he should have paused and said, well, wait a minute, what's your reason here? But he doesn't. So he acts excessively for good motivation. Would you accept that?
No.
No?
No.
You wouldn't accept that there's anything good here.
I don't see a response to this.
Which might have deterred Moses.
Yes.
Yeah, he just stole my mother's purse. Why did you strike your fellow? Oh, well, I get it. Okay, all right, that seems justified. I won't kill you. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Yeah, it raises the interesting question of authorial dexterity. What's the author really up to? And I think the author is up to what we've said he's up to. Every narrative has gaps in it.
Yeah.
That's why every narrative requires, welcomes commentary. You can't fill in all the blanks. Narrative begets more narrative. But the author has to make choices. I'm going to be elaborating here, but I'm not going to be elaborating there because my purpose is. And so would you accept the following rationale for what bothers you? The author's purpose is to display Moses' attributes at the beginning of this long narrative, which only ends at the end of Deuteronomy. And he wants to get out on the table, but in a way that's attractive to us. It's narrative that Moses has these various attributes which are in some way in tension with one another. And that's my point here.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. I mean, it also raises the question that Scott raised about motivation. It would be useful to ask that question. We probably don't have enough material to deal with it, but that's the question you're asking too.
Yeah.
Good. Let's go on a little bit. What a great conversation this has been. So now we're in chapter 3, and we looked at chapter 3 a little bit last week about the burning bush and God giving his essence, his name. What is your name? So what I'd like to do is now think of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4 as also exploring the dilemmas, I might even say the tragedy that accompanies being a prophet. So in chapter 3, chapter 3, where am I here? So the first question that Moses, I'm looking for where Moses raises it. Certainly the author raises it. Who are you? And God says, I am, verse 3, here I am to come closer, and so on. Where does it, oh, it's in verse 13. Oh, I see. So, verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And he said, I will be with you. So to Moses, who am I to do this? God's answer seems to me to be, in some sense, it doesn't matter because I'm committed to your success or your well-being. In a way that goes against everything we've been talking about so far, where Moses' character is built up in very complex ways. And when you have freed the people, middle of verse 12, from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. And Moses said to God, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? So the second question, I've got them a little confused. The first question is, who am I? The second question is, who are you? And God gives his name in two different ways. Cryptically, I am what I am, which can also be understood as I shall be what I shall be. In Hebrew, the tenses, it's not a tense-rich language. So you can say I am what I am, or I will be what I will be. I'm free. God said to Moses, verse 14, Ehiyah Sherhiyah. He continued, thus you shall say to the Israelites, Ehiyah. Ehiyah Sherhiyah. 3 words. You can abbreviate it with one word. Ehiyah. I am. I am being. I think, Doris, last week you said that Aquinas said that God's being, God's essence is his being. That his existence is his essence. Which makes God free. That God is free to be whatever God wants to be because his essence is to be. In verse 15, God further said to Moses, I imagine the gap between 14 and 15 to be a question Moses has asked. Moses is saying, really? That's what I should say to the people? You are being? How? That's not going to sell. Give me something else. So in verse 15, he gives him something else. And God further said to Moses, you say that the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever. So he gives 2 different names, doesn't he? One is, let's just call it philosophical. It's something about essence in abstract language. The other is the God of history. I'm the one who has acted before. I've done certain things. In a way, I have bound myself to the actions that I've already performed. I made a covenant with the ancestors. And a covenant is a promise. And an eternal covenant is an eternal promise. And promises bind the promiser. That's the logic of promises. And so I've got to now do what my promise to your ancestors requires. That's why I'm doing this. And this is my name for all eternity. Hazeh Zichri, my memory, my memorial, how I'm to be understood. Go and assemble the elders and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has appeared to me. I have taken note of you and what is being done to you in Egypt, and I've declared I will take you out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. That's a scary clause, right? The land is not empty. I think one of the slogans of early Zionism was to take a people without a land to a land without a people. Turns out the land without a people was not without a people. And the author here is forthright about it. This is populated. And we know this from history, that Egypt is filled with city-states and walls and kings and so on. You look at the book of Joshua, and the summaries in, say, chapter 12 about all the kings of the land. It presents a problem. They will listen to you, verse 18. No, so the land is described in two ways as well. It's populated, but it's also an ideal land. It's a land of milk and honey, which I take it is also maybe exclusively a metaphor. They will listen to you, then you shall go with the elders of Israel to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, manifested himself to us. Now, therefore, let us go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God. Is this a ruse? I will come back. Yet I know that the king will let you go only because of greater might. So I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with the various wonders which I will work upon them. After that he shall let you go. And I will dispose the Egyptians favorably toward this people, which is what happens later on, so that when you go, you will not go away empty-handed. Each woman shall borrow from her neighbor, and so on and so on. But Moses spoke up and said, what if they don't believe me? Do not listen to me, but say the Lord did not appear to you. So this is the third question. The first question is, who am I to be able to do this? The second question is, who are you to be able to ask me to do this? Okay, now that we've gotten that straight, my relationship with you, the third question is, but who are the people? I mean, after all, I'm trying to bring this message to the people and to lead them out. Are they leadable? Are they amenable to this? And the Lord, Moses spoke, what if they don't believe me and do not listen to me, but say the Lord didn't appear to you? The Lord said to him, what is in your hand? So God's condescending response is, the people are going to be persuaded by tricks. Let's do a little magic, and they will. So, I mean, this raises a general question about the Torah's conviction of the power of tricks, miracles. And really, when you examine how the Bible unfolds from beginning to end, the miracles are front-loaded into the early chapters of the Bible. And the use of miracles diminishes as the Bible unfolds. I wouldn't want to say in a straight line, but there seems to be, from the Bible's point of view, a growing worry about the staying power of miracles. I mean, you could be impressed for a while, but does it stick? You know, these TV evangelists, come on down, they put their hands on your head, and what about the next day? What about 2 days later? What's the half-life of putting hands on somebody's head? I think the Bible is looking for more substantial reasons for belief than miracles. And so he does a bunch of miracles. I want to just go to verse 10 before we stop. Okay, so Moses asked 3 questions. Who am I? Who are you? Who is the people? To which God patiently gives him an answer. Sometimes cryptic, sometimes unsatisfactory. Here's his 4th question. Please, Lord, verse 10, I've never been a man of words, either in times past or now that you have spoken to your son. Slow of speech and slow of tongue. That turns out not to be true. I mean, there's no more valuable person in the history of literature than Moses. But here he's trying to get out of this by saying, a prophet has to deliver a message, and I'm not good at this. And the Lord said to him, now you see, God is getting increasingly impatient. Who gives man speech? Who makes him dumb or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? What difference does it make that you have some physical issue? Your speech is my speech. You're the cipher through which my speech passes through. Now go, and I'll be with you as you speak, and will instruct you what to say. But he said, please, O Lord, make someone else your agent. I mean, all of these questions, I think, point to the recognition of how hard it is to be a prophet. Every single individual or group involved in the act of prophecy is problematic. Who are you? I mean, who am I going to say sent me? Being sent me, really? Who am I? Well, it doesn't matter who you are. I'm with you. Well, who are the people? Well, the people love tricks, so let's give them a few. Oh, and by the way, I don't talk well. I mean, don't you feel the anxiety here of the person called to be a prophet about all the impediments that stand in the way of success? Please, Lord, the end of 13, make someone else your agent. The Lord became angry with Moses. God has gotten fed up. And he said, there's your brother Aaron the Levite. He, I know, speaks readily. Even now he is setting out to meet you, and he'll be happy to see you. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. I will be with you and with him as you speak, to tell both of you what to do. He shall speak for you to the people. He shall serve as your spokesman, with you playing the role of God to him, right? I am a prophet to you. You are a prophet to me. Aaron will be a prophet to you, so to speak, spokesperson. And take you this rod which you shall, with which you shall perform the signs. So I love chapter 3 and 4 as well, for trying to explore from the emotional point of view what it means to be a prophet. I mean, this is the biography of the predominant individual in this whole narrative through the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, so rich stuff, I think, and a rich conversation as well. So next week we'll continue and move on to other things. Shabbat Shalom. Don't forget Kafka tomorrow. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I was terrified.
Oh, well, that's nice of you. I'm moving forward, but I'm moving back. Oh, did I?
And that's what scared me. I've never sat in this position, so I saw this there and I thought, oh my God.
That's sweet of you.
And it kept going like that. And it was like, you couldn't see me.
What happens when the teacher knocks himself out by falling to the ground?
Did you see the New Yorker last week? Yes.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Yes, it's good. Did you happen to see the review in the Times yesterday of the big orchestra in New York?
No.
You get the times?
Electronically.
Take a look. I think it's Oh my God, it's so auditory.
Really?
Not only with the program, which you really love, but also the purpose.
Yeah. I read the notes that George Zell provided on their first recording of the Unfinished, where he comments that in 2 bars in the first movement of the Unfinished, he discovered that the notes were changed.
Really?
Yes.
By Schumann?
No, by a publisher or by a initial. He suspects by an initial performer, conductor.
Of the first movement?
Yes.
Which are very mysterious.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I think just 2 parts. He calls them prettified. Prettified. Yes.
So Schubert
eliminated a distortion or a dissonance. Yes.
Can you send it to me?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. See you then.
Are
I
you
got
in
your
a
call.
huge hurry?
Well, I kind of am.
Okay, then I'll hold it for another time.
I will call you. I will call you because I
Okay.
got your call. I'm sorry.
Okay.
To get back to you.
I wanted to write a different poem for the
Forum.
and I wanted to use the term feast of lots, and I'm not quite sure I understand exactly what it means. So
What's the phrase again?
feast of lots.
Feast of lots.
Lots. L-O-T-S.
Okay. All right. Okay.
I read a little bit about it. I'm not sure how Haman used that.
Right. To
So
pick the
I don't want
date.
to keep you if you're.
Yeah. So I will get back to you. I'll call you and we'll talk about it because I think I understand what it means, but it may be a little cryptic for observers.
I looked it up and I'm not quite sure I understand it, and I don't want to use it wrongly. So
It's the
I
one.
thought
It's
I
the
would
way
ask
in
you.
which they chose the date for the destruction of the Jews.
Okay.
That's how they did it. Lots.
Like pulling lots or pulling straws or
Pulling whatever it is, right. So you put in a bowl pieces of paper. I don't know if this is what it is, but it's like this. With March 31st, March 30th, April 2nd, and you close your eyes and you pick out of 360.
so kind of like a chance.
Kind of like chance. I think that's what it means.
Okay.
But I'll talk to you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll call you later.
Thank you so much.
Nobody asked why I did
Have a good day.
You too. Thanks.
this, even though I I don't know. Right. Yeah.
Why did you do that?
Because he assaulted my sister. It was okay for us. That's what
Yeah, I think, you know, it is being streamed, but I want to come. But I don't want to be the only one. You think there'll be a crowd? Oh.
See everybody.
So, I'm waiting to hear from Jan. She's very strong.
And so he has to do
And I'm not. I don't know what you were talking about. Talking about catering.
senior committee. Are you on that?
Oh, yeah.
We're trying to figure out.
She's so vulnerable.
Yes,
We have to get a new caterer.
Yeah, we need a new caterer. And we had him once. Jay likes it.
Well, they have no control over the money.
Mom thinks that.
Well, the only menu he sent was 3 scoops. We've had for every single luncheon.
Yeah.
Why not?
Fine.
Why not? Well, the caterer I took gave me 2 suggestions. And Janet's, she gave me a salmon suggestion. Janet said, I don't think people will eat soup.
Well, if they eat tuna, they'll eat salmon.
The question is, do you eat salmon?
If they gave you a
Okay.
salmon with a piece of grilled salmon on it, would you eat it? Delicious. I would definitely like it. I mean, if there were, no, she didn't say he doesn't do that. No, no. We're not getting into dietary concerns. If they don't eat it, they don't eat it.
They'll eat around it. I agree.
Oh, I think salmon. And she wants it to look pretty.
Well, of course, any caterer is gonna make it look great.
She said to me in her email, when first we talked, and then she sent me an email, all her suggestions. And, you know,
So, what can we do to bring her around?
So these are the
Cookies or pastries or finger,
Sits there, you know?
all during
Big
lunch.
so
Yeah,
and I said, you have to put whatever it is for dessert on the table.
Right, because it's too much serving and it's too much
Sure, help her used to love her, but she's for sure that I am.
Well,
And I know she suggested, I know,
what you got
some kind, she told us,
10 years ago.
she told me she was, I don't know what shooters are.
You get 10%.
Maybe they were a little shy, she was, which is probably bad, so what she did was, she saw, hey, I think this is English.
and they put it all into the.
Every single one. And Janet says they seem to work well. How many she does, one or two?
No, well, I don't know, and we don't know, because she said she goes with,
Yes,
Bill, her.
Well, so what I'm gonna do,
She takes them.
I've been thinking about it.
So I don't know how many goes.
I have to start. Her other idea was portobello mushroom with roasted vegetables.
I think that you run into more of a problem when you get
I think so too.
I would love that. But I don't think that we should do that.
Especially when you get the church.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not yeah.
I will. And she said she's writing. I won't go into, she said she's writing a book.
And how is that gonna be?
So the question, the question is, do we want to go with the caterer that Maud feels strongly about, or the one that Janet feels strongly? There's nothing the matter with feeling strongly about. She could very well be the best one, if given a chance.
Well, thanks for your opinion.
Anytime, my dear.
Janet Mapp,
She was at the meeting.
yeah, she's been coming, and
And
it's good that she's,
Well, she was investigating one here. And I'm investigating two. And I think that's enough. Driftwood was the other one.
you're right.
The temple uses. But what she sent me was some descriptions. And it was too
So it's
pricey.
hard,
Too pricey anyway. And they're so big. It's like
Yeah.
a big, huge company. I'm Davis.
so I tend to go with little also. So, can we tell her that, that you went with the, that you just went with the choice? That they had the best to offer, that solves your problem.
Can I tell her that you and I decided we need a change? She hasn't come up with anything else. I asked her to come up with something else that he could do.
And you asked her, and
She wanted the suggestions that I got, and I gave them to her, but I said, don't tell him. See what he comes up with.
oh, so you didn't come up with any,
She hasn't responded.
okay. So just say that you had to make a decision. Thank you for all the hard work that you put in, but we decided to go with the most reasonably priced one, and we first and foremost wanted a change in the menu.
Well, not yet. What if she does today?
Well,
What is her position? I mean, what?
She volunteered.
she wants to go, she wants to go with Jane Lights.
Because Cafe 56, because she's worked with him for 25 years and she knows him. And he has always done whatever she asks.